Everything we know about God, we know through our senses. We smell, we hear, we taste, we touch. And this is a scientific approach to nature. We can examine things. We can use our left brain, our rational brain. My approach to entering into the presence of God is to engage my right brain, to use my imagination and my spiritual intuition. This is not anything new. I've been delighted to read that the earliest theologians in the church understood that there was a basic problem with approaching God, and that God is outside of nature, and yet all of our words and concepts are within nature. And so they thought of ways of approaching God that were more contemplative, even taking the theology that they were creating, but approaching it from a contemplative perspective. So what I do when I'm in church is I'll look at the stained glass windows, for example, and I'll imagine that the sunlight that streams through them is transformed into something more like a mystical light. I listen to the music. The choir are singing, the organ especially. And the organ, when the organ is especially loud and thundering, I can feel the vibrations through the pew. And I imagine that this is God's breath, perhaps, whispering through the sanctuary. When I listen to the words that we have in church, the scripture readings, the preaching, the prayers, I understand that these same words have been spoken in the church for 2,000 years in different languages, in different forms, but essentially the same words. And I think about all those prior Christians who were probably a lot like me, and I imagine how they felt about that, what that experience was like for them. When I approach God, approach worship in this more right brain perspective, I find that I do have a deeper, more intimate connection with God. And I don't think it's just being made up. I don't think it's fantasy. I think it really is another way of understanding reality. Now that we're in the pandemic, of course, we're not in our sanctuary. And so I've had to take and think about how do I adapt those same practices, those same principles outside of formal in-sanctuary worship. And so what I do is I'll do things like I'll go out in the backyard, and Becky has planted beautiful gardens, and when it's quiet, I'll sit back there and I'll look, and I can imagine that even though I know Becky planted those flowers, that they were placed there by God. And I think about that and I contemplate that. I try not to get too rational about it. I just let it come into my emotional, creative experience. I'll listen to music. I like to listen to Bach organ pieces or Beethoven or other pieces. And I let that music speak to me as though it were a language that were trying to speak about God in a way that my rational mind couldn't understand. I do this in a lot of ways. The more I do it, even walking around the neighborhood, looking at the trees and how they toss in the wind and telling myself, oh, that's the breath of God tossing those trees. I know it's not, but all of this helps me approach God in a way that I really can't get at with my analytical mind. And so my three questions or practices for you to try this week are, let me read them off. 1, ponder, who is God? Push away any kind of definitive analytical answer you might come up with or anything you've just been told, and think about that. Who is God for you? What does that mean? And I think the more you kind of struggle with it, the closer you're getting to finding something of value. 2nd, find a place or experience that speaks to your spiritual intuition, whether that's a garden, being out in nature in some way, listening to music, whatever moves you in some way, take a hold of that. And then 3rd, just practice using that as a exercise to get closer to God. Practice letting go of your left brain and using your right brain to imaginatively come into the presence of God and see what you find. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening.